Hey people, do you want to get your music into Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Tidal, and all the rest of the streaming services? Check out DistroKid. It's affordable and super easy to use. I've used it to distribute my music and I really dig it. Our listeners get 30% off at distrokid.com/talk guitars. That's 30% off for our listeners at distrokid.com/talk guitars. Go get it. Hey everybody, it's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars. We thought we'd talk about the vintage guitar market. It's kind of a vast topic, but I've been doing a lot of part-time work down at Emerald City Guitars, plug the guitar shop, from time to time. And it's been a blast, but I'm around vintage guitars now all the time, not every day. I'm working there sporadically, but when I am down there, I'm just reminded about that whole world of vintage guitars and how cool it is, how weird it is, how interesting it is, and how there are all kinds of different perspectives about that market. But it's just like anything else, right? It's like, some people collect cars, some people collect jewelry or watches or whatever, or antiques used to be a big deal. Now, maybe not so much, but guitars is one of those things where there are some golden era guitars from the major manufacturers like Gibson and Fender and Gretsch and other ones, Martin. And there's a whole market out there of people who love to collect these things and buy them, and also players too that love these guitars and covet them for various reasons. But yeah, I thought it'd be cool for Chris and I to just chew the fat on it and see what comes of it. Well, to start off, Chris, like what is your kind of feeling about the vintage market? I know that's a big loaded question, but I don't know, just whatever comes to your mind, like what's your reaction when somebody says, why is that guitar so expensive? Or, why, well, you know what I mean? Like,
Right. Unfortunately, I haven't been around vintage guitars like you have for a long time. So I don't know if I really have my finger on the pulse of what shit's going for, other than that what I can see online. But I think things are pretty universal with that market, and it's probably always been there. So I can probably speak to some of those things. The cost of the guitar comes down to a number of factors. Like the one, obviously, it's rare. There's only so many of these guitars on the planet, and it's a very desirable guitar. That's another thing, the desirability of the guitar. Basically, there's not that many of them. If you want one, you're gonna have to pay up.
Yeah.
And if it's a popular one, you're gonna have to fight people to get it. So you're gonna pay more.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think there's a lot of sour grapes with a lot of guitar players. This has been going on for years, where everybody says it's just lawyers and doctors that can afford all the vintage instruments now. And that may be true to a certain extent. But for me personally, it's probably been maybe 15, 20 years or something since I've just kind of checked myself out of the vintage market, as far as like, I'm never going to have a burst.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm never going to have a 50s Telly
Yeah.
or anything like that. I don't think, you know what I mean? But I've learned to find ways to deal with that, to get vintage guitars that are less desirable, or reissues of vintage guitar that have the same kind of vibe.
Yeah.
But going back to what you said, my main thing, I guess I would say, is the guitar is so expensive because the rareness of it and the desirability has put it where it is in the market. And it's like, if you want one of those, you're going to have to pay up for it, like it or not.
And I guess delving more into the factors that go into like why some of these guitars are coveted by players or even collectors is also, well, let's talk about players, for instance, because I'm like you, I'll never be able to afford a Burst or a super vintage guitar that is one of the sought after guitars. But like you said, I think it's cool to come across guitars that maybe have a refinish, or maybe a headstock break, or some issues that make it a lot more affordable for somebody like you or me, right? And then, these are called player grade vintage guitars, essentially. And it's cool to come across these because essentially if most of the parts are original, like the pickups and everything else, the electronics, and maybe there's just some issues with it, you can get it for considerably less than you might pay. I mean, now that's within reason. Like we're talking maybe like juniors and, well, Les Pauls too, but not a Burst or a V from the 50s or an Explorer. But there's a certain kind of selection of guitars that I think some people who are not of wealthy means could afford. So I think that's kind of cool. I like that when you brought that up. But in terms of the desirability of these guitars by players, yes, it's the rareness and things. But if they're a player, they like the way like Martins. Let's take Martins for instance. Like the golden era of Martins. There's a reason people love these guitars because of the way they were built, because of the materials that were used, and just the vintage of these guitars. And with acoustics especially, the more you play them, the better they sound. And it, basically you can figure it out. Like when it's first built, it doesn't know it's a guitar. I've heard Luther say it doesn't know it's a guitar yet, right? And you have to play it to kind of get the wood going and break it in so that it starts to vibrate, and do all the guitar things it needs to do. So for players, there's more than just the collectible aspect of these guitars. They're actually tools that are cool because they sound a certain way. And these vintage guitars have, if they're electric guitars, they have pickups that are desirable and things like that. So there's kind of different camps in terms of who's buying these instruments, and it's kind of interesting to think about that.
And I was thinking of this while you were talking about why are these guitars so expensive? You hear a lot of times someone will say, is that guitar really $30,000 better than this guitar? For me, sometimes yes. Depending on what it is. It very well could be. You're talking about an old Martin, even more than any of the electric guitars, the Martins and the acoustic guitars. It's like you said, they get a certain age and they start to come into it. It's like a Stradivarius or something. From being and vibrating and all this use it's gotten over the years, it just kind of like seasons it and it sounds great. So if that guitar is like $28,000 or something like that, you can get a guitar that sounds great. A reissue Martin, or get even a 50s Martin that are kind of semi-affordable now, or a 60s Martin, and they're going to be great. That guitar will do anything you want to do, but it's not the same as certain 30s Martin guitar. You're just not going to find them. So there's a saying that I kind of think is accurate, but it's kind of got negative connotations the way that it's used. It's that you either get it or you don't, and that's really true. But it's always used in the context of an argument or something where there's somebody's like saying, my view is the best. But it's true. If you're a fan of electric guitars and you're a fan of the vibe of the guitars, when you pick up the guitar, it's the whole guitar. It's not the pickup. It's not, just the way the guitar feels. When you play it, what happens, your, relationship between you and the guitar. If you're really a fan of vintage guitars in that way, you do get it and you will know. You know what I mean? And sure, you may never be able to find a burst, but if I wanted to get a really cool vintage guitar right now, the one, and I didn't want to spend a lot of money, it would be a Melody Maker. You know, and you can still get those for a really good price. And they're basically like a junior pretty much. Sure, they have those crappy pickups sometimes, but you can find the pick guard and assembly with a P. I think Jason Lawler makes one. It's got the P90 on the pick guard. So you take the old pick guard assembly with the pickup and everything, put it in the guitar case and slap one of those on. And you have like a poor person's junior. Yeah. And that's, and it's old wood and it has that feel, that vibe. So that's cool. You can do it, but there's some 50s and 60s, early 60s Fenders. No way. Say goodbye to those. Yeah. And same with like a lot of the Gibsons. But, for a lot of years, certain models will, kind of come into favor, and other models that are nearly identical will not. A case in point is it used to be you could, an ES335, a Dot ES335, you would spend almost sometimes twice as much as you would for an ES345 from the same year. Yeah. And it's basically the same construction. It probably sounds the same, but it's like that's the one that everybody wanted. That was the jazz guitar that all those session players played. And I want this. It's got to be the 335. So there's other models like that, like what you just recently did. There's the Epiphone Casino that the Beatles made really, really popular. The 60s Gibson made Epiphone Casino. And then there's the ES330, which you got. So if you were going to get a Casino, you would probably pay, I think it might even be close to double, because and it's the same guitar, basically. The ES330 and the Casino are the same damn guitar with a little bit of, cosmetic differences. Yeah. So if I was going to get one of those guitars right now, I would do what you did. I'd get the Gibson. And the only reason why is because Gibson cheapened the Epiphone brand so much that it's kind of like makes it kind of not as special. You know what I mean? So what you paid for that, it's a 61. 61, yeah. It was totally affordable. And it's a guitar, as you mentioned, the same way, it's a guitar that you're going to take out and you're going to play. Yeah, totally. I wouldn't buy a guitar that I couldn't play.
Exactly.
I love vintage guitars, but I don't think I would ever buy a guitar that I wouldn't take to any bar that I'd play. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So navigating the vintage market it can be tricky, but if you're into vibey guitars, there's other things you can do. Some reissues get pretty close too. I
Yeah.
have my 52 Telecaster reissues from 1990. It's not really, it's a cool guitar, but the finish is off. So it looks like it, especially from a distance, but it sounds like it. And that's what
Yeah.
all I care about. But my other guitar, like my Gibson ES guitar, that is really close
Yeah.
to like the vintage vibe. I mean, I was looking for those, and I wanted a 335. So I was looking for the thing we're talking about. I was trying to get a
Uh-huh.
deal on a 335 on a vintage guitar that wasn't $25,000. So I was looking at maybe 70s, early 70s, maybe like player grade ES 335s, and I found a few and I played them, and I'm like, this doesn't feel right. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
beautiful, and the finish and everything felt great, but the neck was a little off. It was a little skinny, and the frets were really low, and it just didn't play very well. And when I picked up that 345, instantly it was like, that's that vibe, that
That's
vintage vibe.
cool.
That there's nothing in that guitar. It does basically the same thing for me. I mean, and that's as close as I'm going to get. It was a
Yeah.
pricey guitar, but it wasn't $35,000. So
No, and like you say, that is a great guitar. And that's another great point too, is you can get reissues now or custom shop guitars that are considerably cheaper than vintage guitars that for all intents and purposes feel and play like a vintage guitar. And so that's another way into kind of guitars that you might feel are unattainable or untouchable, but you can have something that's a very reasonable facsimile for a lot less money. And they're great guitars. Your ES guitar is, and it, for the listeners, it is one of the coolest guitars. The sunburst is cool. It's got a light finish on it. I mean, if you looked at it just from a distance, you'd think it's a vintage ES guitar, but it's really cool. It sounds great too. But to your point about if you know, or whatever you said, but if you know, or you don't know.
if you get it, yeah.
Yeah, that is true. But I've experienced some really cool situations down at the shop. For instance, this one story, I tell this all the time because it's just a cool story that kind of reinforces how special some of these guitars are. This woman came into the shop. She's a bluegrass player. She's not a pro, but she plays bluegrass, and she plays a Taylor, which are great guitars. That
Right.
Taylor's one of the main brands for acoustic guitars these days.
Classic American guitar by nowadays.
Yeah. And she did what Chris and I are talking about. She looked at the wall of Martins and she goes, God, why is that thing $40,000? And I said, well, play it. And so she, and
I
it,
love doing that.
and yeah, and I can't remember specific year, but it was a small box Martin, like I think it was from the 40s. Beautiful guitar, super cool. And she played it, and I said, play a bunch of these guitars. And I just left her alone for like an hour, and she sat in there and played these guitars. And I came back, and she was grinning, and she had that Martin that she pulled down. And she said, this is my favorite one. And I said, yeah. Do you understand now, right? Why? And she got it. And so to me, that is such a cool thing about allowing people to kind of get their hands on these things. And if they are players, they'll get it. They'll sit down, even if it's an electric or an acoustic, they'll sit down and they'll play it, and maybe they'll A/B it with other guitars too, and they'll say, oh man, yeah, now I get it. Now I get it. Why this thing is so cool. And especially players, right? They know they're the ones that seek out these guitars, or they play them in studios and stuff like that. And there's a reason that they're coveted, is because they sound amazing and they play really well. And so it's kind of fun for me to see those situations happen, right? Somebody will come in and they go, why is that so expensive? And you go, well, play it. And then they'll play it, and then they'll see. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of fun.
Right. And find another one. That's it. I mean, there's not that many of them, and they're very individualistic things. It's like they have their, like I said, I keep mentioning vibe. That's what it is. It's that whole thing. But on the other hand, I totally get someone that would say, yeah, and I hear this all the time. It's like, there's no guitar in the world that's worth $25,000 or something like that. And that's like, to that person, that's cool. And, that's, I respect that. But to me, I definitely think there is. I mean, if I had the dough, you know what I mean? So,
totally.
And amps, the same thing, you know what I mean? But amps, you can still get good deals right now. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, guitars are the thing that are off the hook, but amps, I mean, I don't know why anybody would play a new amp now. I'm glad they do because the reason the old ones are affordable now is because
Yeah,
you can get an old Bassman, an old Vibrolux, or just, an old, even an old Deluxe or something like that for, sometimes you in the ballpark, like a Silverface Deluxe in the ballpark of what a modern Fender reissue or something's
totally.
going. There's no comparison there.
No.
With pedals and amps, there's still deals to be had in the vintage market, and you can still get something cool and vibey, but it's not a guitar. The guitar is like the most personal thing. You know what I
Uh,
mean? It sits
yeah,
in your lap and you just interact with it. So
totally. Well, yeah, the amp thing is cool that you mentioned because exactly. I mean, you and I talk about this all the time. It's like there's a ton of great modern amp builders, but like you said, if I had my druthers and I'm gonna, because the boutique amps are expensive. Oh, and if you compare some of the modern amps to, like you're saying, a vintage Fender or even a Gibson or Ampeg or whatever, it's comparable. So for me, I'd rather buy a cool old black panel or silver panel Fender and have that amp as opposed to having a new amp. And I would gig with it. I mean, I do. I mean, you and I both do that. We have 70s and you have 60s amps and stuff you gig with. So that's my thing. It's like I would, for the money, I would much rather, yeah, buy a vintage amp that's cool. And if I'm going to spend that much money on an amp, I'm going to go get a vintage one because it's
yeah.
just they're cool. They sound great, and yeah,
I saw something recently. It's not the modern apps. I think it's the modeling apps, and it made me feel really good because I feel the same way. But sometimes I just don't put it out there. But it was that Tom Bukovac when he was talking about they were asking him about modeling apps. What do you think about modeling apps? What if? And he's like, if I had to play one of these, I would quit playing guitar. And I really love that because I kind of feel the same way.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
really a hot take, but it really is. I find myself saying this all the time, the modeling amps and all this stuff is coming along, and I'm sure it is, but to me, it's not. You know what I mean? It
yeah,
just it
yeah,
doesn't possess that thing for me. Yeah, and the same with the modern amps. I I have played some really good sounding Fender reissues. We may have talked about this before, but
yeah,
I've also
yeah.
played some really bad ones. But when you pop them open, it's that's where the difference is, the
Yeah,
main
the
difference. It's
PC
like,
boards and
yeah,
all that
we got a
stuff.
VCR versus an amplifier, you know what I mean? But yeah, so but back to the guitar thing, that question of is this guitar really X amount of dollars better than this? Yeah, I don't think you can really put a price on it for the person who's going to get that, you know what I mean? Because it's
Yeah.
absolutely worth that much more to them.
Well, and that's just it. To me, it's like it or not, like there are markets for certain things. Like we talked, like there are people that love classic cars and they have a shit ton of money and they have these garages full of 50s and 60s and 70s cars because they love cars. And, is a 1965 Camaro, in mint condition worth, $250,000? Well, to some person or dude, probably a dude, it is. It's funny because when you and I were kids, I mean, we're old enough now where we can talk about kind of the pre-vintage market. I mean, there were people collecting guitars when you and I were young, but there was not a vintage market as we know it today, right? Like that Rick Nielsen was collecting guitars, Crosby,
Yeah.
Stills, Nash were collecting guitars, and there were people who dug these guitars. They knew, the Martins and the Gretches and the Gibsons. They knew about them and they were digging them. But there wasn't like you could buy a used 60s Gibson Les Paul for cheap for like
Right.
a few $100. Like
Or even I think
you
the
know?
the 50s, the late 50s Les Pauls, like the Bursts and stuff, they got quite expensive, like
The
probably the
Bursts did,
80s.
but you could get a gold
But
top or any of that other,
no, you're
especially
you're
the
right.
P90 ones.
No, I remember that John Entwistle. I mean, he was the first person that I ever like. There was an article on his guitar collection. I'm like, wow, he plays bass and he's got all these cool guitars, and that was like
Yeah.
in the 70s.
But for
I
us, like looking for guitars, like I just remember they were used guitars. And like
Right.
I remember a friend pulling this, it was probably a 50s Telly from under his dad's bed or something like that. And I just yawned at it,
Yeah.
because I was a long-haired, pimply-faced rocker that wanted higher output stuff at the time. It was, now I'd go, Jesus, that Telly's so
Right.
cool. It's a Blackguard, from the video. But at the time I didn't give a shit. And again, just guitars were used guitars. Oh, well, that's a used guitar. It's a used Gibson. Okay, well, but now it's like even like 70s guitars are going up and
Yep.
becoming, which
Yeah.
people piss on those eras for Fender and Gibson, but
They're starting to not to. I sold my friend, my who was my bandmate when I lived down at when I lived down. I basically lived down at Emerald City Guitars. I saw them a really sweet Sunburst 1971 Telecaster, all
oh,
original.
cool.
That was great
Yeah.
for $1,200.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, and that I mean, he made a good investment. That's the one thing
Super.
I never really got. I don't understand, but I'm not really like a finance dude or whatever. But people talk
Uh-huh.
about collecting guitars. It's like
Yeah.
it seems like that seems like a pretty poor thing to collect. You know what I mean? Let's say you bought a burst and you paid $225,000 for it and you
Right.
sold it for $230,000. I don't know, I'm probably missing something, but if I wanted to something for an investment, it wouldn't be guitars. You know what I mean?
Well,
It's
it's crazy. This market, yeah, you're mentioning that, but it's like there are collectors that have a ton of money that are that's their thing.
well,
And
how are
maybe
you going to
it,
make how are you going to monetize? How are you going to make money off of something like, let's say they collect like custom shop stuff or something
yeah,
like
yeah,
you buy that for, like $6,000 or something like that. And maybe down the road, you can sell it for
yeah,
$6,500 or
yeah,
something. I don't, some of the big vintage stuff, there has to be something like where something changed. We had that like 90s bubble thing where everything got
yeah,
really expensive. And I think
yeah.
people that sold then probably made a lot of money, but I don't know if we're
I,
going to have another one of those.
my take is, and I don't have inside information, but I mean, just kind of through osmosis, when I hear, Trevor and other people talking about it is, I think the people who are collecting these things, yeah, they want to hang on to them and maybe they even want to like pass them on to their kids or whatever as, you know what I mean? And then also I think they're like they're desirable things to have. I want that. You know what I mean?
Right. No, I
Like
get that.
the 58V, like I want that guitar because there was only so many of them made and I
Right.
don't care. I know it's not going to go up in value in a year or 2 years or 5 years, but I'm going to get it. And it will go up over time because those 58Vs are like really rare and especially the Explorers too from that era too. So I think there's more of a thing like I know it's not like, okay, I'm going to buy all this shit and it's going to go up in value in like 5 years. I think rather these people who have the money to buy those things, they're just, they're looking at the desirable things that they want and they go, I want that. I want that guitar because it's cool and it's desirable. And yeah,
I
I
get
gotta have
that.
it.
I get that. But yeah, I mean, there's all this talk, and though I don't believe it, there might be something that does something to the market is like people are going to be less and less into that old stuff. So somebody that maybe they will cap off, like the burst, and
Yeah.
maybe it will cap off. I don't know.
Yeah.
I kind of think that people will always want them. So I guess you're right. To me, it just seemed like it was a hard way to make money because you'd
Yeah.
have to sit on it for a long time. But I guess if you bought like a vintage guitar, like 50s, 60s Fenders, like in like the 80s, late 80s, and then
Oh
towards the
man.
towards the the end of the 90s into the early 2000s when that big bubble started building up.
Yeah.
You could make a lot of money then. But yeah, I mean, and again, I like to think of guitars as getting played. That's the whole thing. That's
Yeah.
when I talk about a vibe, I'm talking
Yeah.
about establishing a relationship with the guitar. It's not like
Yeah.
I don't think of it as like a collectible thing. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's more than that. It's got more soul than that. So I guess I don't understand that. I kind of separate in my mind, like the collector who's like that, like the 80s Japanese who got all the American guitars and shuttled them over there.
Yeah.
That as opposed to somebody who like collects vintage guitar, like someone like Mike Campbell or something who collects
Yeah.
vintage guitars because
Yep.
he wants to play them and use them.
Yep.
I understand that more than the other thing. But just having a room full of guitars that you have like your buddies come over and you smoke cigars and you pull out your card and say, "Look at this." It's like, yeah, that
Yep.
I don't understand that, I guess, but I know that it happens. I
Yeah.
speak, yeah, I speak to the vintage guitar thing as more of like I said, more of a relationship, something like a physical relationship you have with the instrument.
Yeah, and I think that's where we both come from. And I think it's because we're players, and I think that's what I really appreciate. I appreciate players at, like Jason Isbell or Mike Campbell or these people that play these guitars. They take them on tour,
It
just
should be.
insure them and take the thing I love about Mike Campbell is he had those guitars back in like he had a broadcaster and that gold top deluxe and all these cool guitars way back in
Right,
those were his guitars that he was playing. So, or Rick Nielsen, right? He takes
right.
guitars out and tours them. But I'm the same way. I don't like to think of some rich person's warehouse or penthouse full of these guitars in glass cases. But the flip side of that is I can understand their allure. I mean, I mean, I love them. And to you and I, they are so much more than just an object, right? And maybe some of these people do appreciate them for what they are beyond just an object. You know what I mean?
No,
Like
I
they
bet
don't,
you that.
yeah, they don't have to be players, but they can appreciate the fact that, okay, Brazilian rosewood was being used, all these tone woods that are really scarce now are being used. And this is the golden era of this Gibson or Fender guitar or Martin, and they appreciate all the coolness. But yeah, I've seen most of those personalities come through, right? The in the 90s, like you were saying, a lot of tech dudes were just somehow they got on guitars, man. Let's go get it.
Right, right.
Guitars are cool to collect. It's like they don't play, they don't really even know, and they were collecting these guitars, And then sure, like you said, when the bubble burst, it's like, hey, I got to offload these guitars. It's like, okay, cool. Jay's like, great. Here's the deal. But I'm the same way. I love, reading an article or watching an interview where somebody's got this vintage Les Paul or Strat or whatever it is, and they're playing it and they're touring with it. These guitars, it's a life or lives, right? Like we talk about. You open that case, and where's that guitar been? And it's still doing its thing. It's still working. It's still earning its keep. It's like it's not just sitting in somebody's closet or under a bed. It's like some person's taking this out on tour and playing the damn thing. And I think that's so cool.
One thing I tend to forget sometimes is like you and I are pretty fortunate in that we've had access to a lot of vintage guitars over the years. And there's a lot of people out there that probably a lot of their opinions are formed with, they really haven't had a chance to experience a lot of these. And it kind of sucks. I mean, even before I moved to Seattle, we have many vintage guitar shops here, but I lived by, walking distance from Elderly Instruments in the 80s. So it's like I always was around them. So I kind of see that. So I can imagine somebody like looking at the prices and going, holy crap, that looks just like my Epiphone. Why is that much more expensive than that? I totally get that.
Yeah. And that's why I like the fact that there are stores like Elderly Instruments or Emerald City Guitars or Carter Vintage or whatever, where somebody can go there and see for themselves, pick it up, play it, and see if these instruments resonate with you, and you start to understand why they're so sought after and why they're so special, and like I said, I've seen it happen so many times, and people are their reaction's cool too, because they're like, you say, well, pick it up and play it, and they go, really? I can do that? It's like, yeah, that's what they're here for, man. And so there is that intimidation too, right? It's people like, oh, that's a 52 Telly, I don't want to touch that. It's like, well, yeah, it's meant to be played. You got it, and if you want to see for yourself why it's so cool, and 9 times out of 10, they see it, they play it through an amp, and they like, oh my God, this is so cool. It sounds cool. It does what people told me it was supposed to do, which is cool.
It's a thing. Yeah. One thing to touch upon, but I really don't want to go down this slippery slope because it's just fucking annoying,
man. Let's slide.
Well, it's like the relic thing and where that came from.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Because I'm not going to go down that. I don't want to talk about relics, but I do want to say that the vintage guitar market, when that first came out, and I think Fender was the one that I noticed most doing that. And I was like in a Guitar Center or something, and I saw one of the first things, and they were super tasteful. And it's like, look, this kind of feels, it was, a lacquer guitar, and it kind of feels like an old one. And I get that. It's like, I can't afford a 50s Telecaster, but I see this one is like a 50s Telecaster, and it kind of has a little bit of head start. It feels a little vibey or something. And I kind of was like, I get that, I understand that, but where that led is just so horrible, and it has nothing to do with, trying to give you like the vibe of a vintage. It's just like, take an orbital sander to this guitar, and and that's what it is. It's a relic, and that's what a relic means now. But I just wanted to touch upon that. Is that thing was an early version of trying to give you a little bit of that vibe, and it was very popular. I mean, it's still. I mean, the fact that they're still doing it just got out of control. But again, I digress. I don't want to go down and talk about relics.
Well, you started it, but I won't go much farther. But I agree with you, and I think that is exactly. I think it was well intended, and then people got carried away, and it's just silly now. But another cool aspect of that is buying a guitar that like you were saying, that was lightly relic or something, is you didn't feel as precious about it, right? So the ding you put on it, you didn't feel as guilty about because it's already kind of worn in a little bit. And for me, that's kind of big, right? Because I remember buying brand new guitars and I was so like, I didn't want to, when I put a ding in it, I'm like, fuck, but then once you put a few in, you're like, okay, fine now. But yeah, so I agree. I mean, I think it started off with good intentions, and then just, of course, as it does, people get carried away and it becomes a weird thing.
I don't think I would ever buy a new guitar. I don't know, I don't know. It's something that doesn't even kind of, by chance, I got one because it was like, an impulse buy. I got one of them and it quickly aged really well, but it's like, I want used guitars. I mean, I would be bummed out depending on what sort of dent or chip or depending on where it was and what the guitar was like. But usually I don't baby my guitars ever. Yeah. And if I even was fortunate to have a fairly rare vintage instrument, I would play it. Guitars aren't things to me that should be babied.
Well, you mentioning, wondering whether these guitars will hold their value as generations come into their own. Because I think of a friend of mine who his parents stocked away all these antiques, tons, but they stored away a lot of like the old, huge, like oak, beautiful, beautiful furniture. But like nobody wants that stuff now, right? Because it's like, I live in an apartment in Green Lake. Why do I want this huge oak? I'm 5 stories up. You know what I mean? So I do wonder about that all the time. I wonder if the market will shift and if some of these coveted guitars will just fall out of favor, but it'll be interesting to see,
with some of that stuff. And I think guitars will be like that to some extent, and maybe furniture too. They will have resurgences where they'll get popular again. I think something like, like Danish modern was, a thing
That's true.
Or whatever. But there's other things like what you're talking about that I think are more like permanently not worth anything. An example would be the old metal erector set. I don't know if you know what that was.
I do.
I'm too young. I'm too young for that. But I remember, like the generation before me probably played with that. Yeah. And those used to be, here's a mint. Everything is in here. The erector set. It's like all the packaging. Everything is, $300. And now you can't get $20 for them anymore. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because all the people who thought that was cool are dead. And it wasn't the kind of thing where people it became a thing. Like there's like, the erector. I mean, there's a vintage toy market. So, but
I was going to say model trains, right? Is that still a thing or has that gone out of favor?
No, that's probably going to, be something that comes around. So I think furniture, I don't know. I'm not an expert on this shit, but it's just kind of interesting to think about that because I do know things that, I mean, the toys from when we were kids are really expensive right now. But when these people kick off, I don't know if nobody's ever going to be.
Yeah.
That sort of thing, I don't know if it is, but guitars, there's always going to be music, and you're going to be able to reference that. And you're going to see all these bands. So it's just going to keep kind of going unless people that say like every 10 years or something, the guitar is dead, if it ever does die. And maybe that'll change. But I think, I don't know. I think that people are going to want to collect this shit for a long time.
I hope so.
People are always going to be asking, why the fuck is that guitar so much money when I have a guitar that looks just like that is 1/332 of the price?
And then you put the real deal in their hands, and 9 times out of 10 they're going to go, you'll see the light go on over their head. They'll go, oh, I get it.
And it should be pointed out that not every vintage thing is excellent. There are some things that are just okay, some of them that are downright not great. Yep. But a shop like Emerald City Guitars and like Frank's Thunder Road, they curate that stuff. Yep. So it's you're not going to go in there, and very rarely you're going to find a dog because they don't buy that stuff. They don't have that in there.
Exactly.
So shopping someplace like that is a lot of time. People that come in there, they get like the cream of the crop, which is great,
Well, thanks for listening, everybody, so much. We really appreciate it. This was a good talk. Check us out on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and wherever you consume your podcasts. And we're part of the Ruinous Media Network. Psyched to be a part of that team. And go to our website, chrisandricktalkguitars.com. We post our stuff there too. And keep listening and reach out to us and ask us questions or interact with us. We'd love to hear from you. Chris, what do you got?
Play guitar and make it a vintage one too.